I'm Grace Whitman, 27, and the morning I buried my father, the church smelled like lilies and candle wax, the kind of scent that settles into your coat and follows you home. The bell tolled while my stepmother Lila took the podium in a black veil that turned her face into a smooth, unreadable shape. She lifted a thick envelope, announced that my father had left her, the companies, the accounts, and the marble and glass mansion on the hill. A murmur rolled through the pews, and beside me, my brother Noah went cold and quiet, hands clenched so tight his knuckles blanched. Lila thanked the crowd, then turned and told us the household would be reorganized immediately, which was a softer way to say we were no longer welcome in the only home we had ever known. I kept my back straight and my voice even because grief has its own kind of spine, and mine refused to bend. She didn't know everything my father built or what he protected before he died. As the choir began a low hymn, I understood that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a fight I hadn't asked for, but would finish. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to erase you, tap that like and subscribe so we can walk through this together. I grew up in a small brick bungalow before the fortune ever arrived a place where you could hear the washer thump through the hallway and the windows stuck every spring. My father kept a paper calendar nailed to the kitchen wall and circled our birthdays in red. My mother, before she passed, wrote our lunch notes on scrap envelopes and tucked them into brown paper bags. When Dad's company took off and we moved to the estate, he made a point of bringing the old kitchen table along a scarred slab of oak that never quite matched the polished floors. He said it reminded him of the years when nothing came easy. He wasn't sentimental about objects, but he was stubborn about values. Keep your word. Look people in the eye, leave a place better than you found it. I learned those lessons at that table leg swinging above the tile, while Noah practiced scales in the next room until his hands could roll a melody without looking. The mansion changed our zip code, but it didn't change the rhythm at home. Dad ate late, but he always came to the doorway of the music room and tapped the metronome for Noah, laughing when the cat swatted at it. He'd ask me about my day like it was a meeting that needed notes. He wanted to know what I was building, even if it was just a stack of ideas and a coffee stain on a library book. We grew tomatoes and planters on the terrace because Rosa said, "You can't trust store-bought to taste like summer," and the three of us would stand there with salt and napkins, eating over the sink like it was a sacrament. Wealth made things smoother. No more bounce checks, no more thin coats in February, but it wasn't supposed to rewrite who we were. When Lila came into our lives, she fit into the photographs easily enough. She had a talent for centerpieces and thank you notes, for remembering the names of board members' spouses and arranging flowers that looked like they'd been painted. I tried to be fair. My father loved her, and he asked us to try. But the house felt different in small ways. A locked drawer here, a new staffer there, Brooke's laughter echoing down halls where Noah used to rehearse. Lila wasn't unkind to our faces, but there was a temperature shift I could feel in my bones, like a draft you can't find even when you seal every window. Dad grew thinner that last year, and work shifted from expansion to maintenance. He talked less about acquisitions and more about the garden, about the fountain that needed a new pump, and the roses that wouldn't take on the east slope. I told myself the quiet was just fatigue. I told myself a lot of things. Standing in that church, I kept hearing his voice from years earlier when he walked us through the gardens at dusk, hand on my shoulder, explaining that a house isn't a trophy, it's a trust. He said it in the way men speak when they are teaching you how to carry something heavy the right way so you don't hurt your back. Trust meant stewardship. It meant the library would stay open to the neighborhood kids who came for homework help. It meant the piano in the great room belonged to more than one pair of hands. I believed him because he'd never given me a reason not to. So when Lila held up that will and smiled through a veil, as if sorrow and satisfaction could sit side by side, something inside me settled into place. Not panic, not even anger, yet just a clear, steady refusal. My father didn't raise us to fold. We left the church without the car that was supposed to ferry us home, the sidewalk bright with camera flashes that turned the day into a stuttering reel of white squares. Noah asked what we were going to do, and I told him the only thing I knew for certain. We were going back to the house to pack a few pieces of our parents' lives, a watch, a journal, a photograph, objects that shouldn't need a signature to claim. The road up to the estate winds through old oaks and fieldstone walls, and I can still trace every turn by memory, even now. As the cab climbed, the light slid across the mansion's windows, and for a second I could see our reflections like ghosts coming home. Then the gates rose out of the hedges, steel black, and closed a pair of guards standing like bookends at a shelf that no longer needed us. One stepped forward and lifted a hand. He said he had orders. I rolled down the window, gave my name, and watched his eyes as he didn't flinch. Another man spoke into a radio, the kind of quiet conversation that makes you feel erased while you're still in the room. Past the hedges, I could see movement fabric pulled from curtain rods, crates stacked on the steps, roses cut back to bare canes. Lila appeared at the top of the stairs. Brooke a step behind both, dressed in black like the service had simply moved outdoors. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The gate stayed shut, the guards didn't shift, and the cab's meter ticked on with the steady patience of a clock that knows it can outlast you. I reached for the door handle, felt Noah's hand on my sleeve, and looked back at the house that had contained our whole childhood in its echo. We were not getting in that day. And as the engine idled and the guard repeated his instructions, I understood this was only the first lock we would have to learn how to open. The cab idled a few yards from the gate, its engine a low hum beneath the sound of rustling leaves. I stepped out first, gravel crunching under my shoes, and the air smelled faintly of rain. The guards didn't move. One of them adjusted his earpiece, the other folded his arms, both waiting for a signal I knew would come from the porch above. Noah stayed close behind me, his voice barely a whisper. "What if she doesn't let us in?" I didn't answer right away. The sight of the house stole my breath, its tall windows catching the last bit of daylight, the garden stripped bare of color. Everything my father and mother had built together now looked like a stage set, repainted for someone else's play. Then Lila appeared at the top of the stairs, her heels sharp against the stone, a phone in one hand, a crystal glass in the other. Brooke trailed her chin, tilted arms crossed. Grace Lila called down her tone, polished smooth. "You shouldn't be here." She said it the way people do when they're reminding you of a rule they just invented. I looked past her toward the doorway where boxes were stacked curtains half torn from their rods. "I came for Dad's things," I said. "Just a few of his personal items. Then we'll go." Brooke laughed under her breath, the sound thin and practiced. "That's not how this works anymore," she said. Lila started down the steps, her black dress moving like liquid. "Your father entrusted the estate to me," she said, every word steady. "Everything inside these gates is now under my care. If you want something, you'll need to speak with my attorney." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my tone even. "You're hiding behind lawyers to keep a daughter from holding her father's watch." She smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "I'm protecting what's mine." Brooke leaned against the gate, tilting her head. "Maybe he didn't want you to have anything," she said, her voice light but cutting. Noah stiffened beside me. "Don't talk about him like that." His hands shook, but he didn't back down. The guard's radio crackled, and one of them murmured, "Orders confirmed." The gate clanged shut with a final sound that made my stomach drop. I took a step closer, my fingers curling around the iron bar. "You can change the locks," I said quietly, "but you can't change who this house belongs to." Lila's expression didn't flicker. "We'll see," she said, and turned back toward the porch. Brooke followed her laughter, trailing behind her like perfume. The guards stayed where they were until we returned to the cab. I didn't look back until the car began to roll downhill, the mansion shrinking behind us, the sunset painting its windows gold. Noah pressed his forehead to the glass. "It doesn't even look like home anymore," he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak the image of uprooted rose bushes burning in my mind. We spent that night at a roadside inn just off the highway. The carpet smelled faintly of chlorine from the pool outside, and the single lamp flickered every few minutes. Noah sat on the bed, scrolling through pictures of the mansion on his phone photos taken before the funeral when the garden still bloomed and the fountain still ran. I listened to the steady click of his thumb on the screen until he set it down and said, "She's really going to erase everything, isn't she?" His voice cracked on the last word. I stared at the wall for a long time before answering, "Not if we can help it." I didn't know how yet, but the thought of doing nothing felt unbearable. By morning the clouds had cleared, and the light spilling through the curtains reminded me of the mornings when Dad would tap on my door with coffee and tell me to face the day, not fight it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through his contacts until I found a number I hadn't called in years, Daniel Mercer, his oldest friend and partner at Whitman Holdings. My thumb hovered over the call button. Noah watched me from the table, a question in his eyes. I pressed dial. When Daniel answered, his voice was rougher than I remembered, but steady. "Grace," he said quietly. "I was waiting for this call." We met him that afternoon outside the old corporate building downtown. The headquarters had been moved years ago, but the sign still bore my father's name in brass letters. Daniel leaned on a cane, now his hair silver at the temples, but his handshake was firm. "Your father trusted you," he said. "Both of you." I asked him straight out if he knew anything about the will Lila presented. His jaw tightened. "That document doesn't match your father's instructions. Months before he fell ill, he created a trust, the Whitman family trust meant for you and Noah. It included the mansion and the controlling shares of his company." My breath caught. "Then why?" He raised a hand. "The original paperwork disappeared from the records shortly before his death. I suspect Lila's lawyers had access. But a trust like that doesn't vanish completely. Your father made sure copies existed. Find Peter Lang, he's the one who drafted it." As we walked away, Noah's steps quickened to keep up. "If this is true, she can't keep the house." His face lit with something I hadn't seen since before the funeral, hope. I wanted to believe it. The drive back to the motel felt shorter somehow, the fields outside the window no longer just gray stretches of land, but paths toward something possible. Still, Daniel's warning echoed in my head. She won't go down quietly. The next morning, we sat in Peter Lang's office downtown. His space was lined with case books and a single framed photograph of my father shaking his hand. The sight of it made my throat tighten. He rose from behind the desk, his voice gentle. "Your father spoke of you often," he said, motioning for us to sit. "I'm deeply sorry for your loss." I asked him if the trust existed. He didn't hesitate. "It does. I drafted it myself. Your father wanted to ensure the mansion and most of his estate went to his children." He paused, frowning. "But I no longer have the original files. They vanished from my archive a few months before his passing." Noah leaned forward. "Vanished." Peter nodded. "I believe someone accessed them without permission, likely under your stepmother's instruction. But I keep encrypted backups. If we can verify them, the court can override the forged will." I felt a pulse of energy beneath my grief, something alive and determined. "Then we'll prove it," I said. "Whatever it takes." Peter smiled faintly. "You'll need witnesses' records, anyone who can testify about your father's condition when those papers were signed." He tapped his pen on the desk. "Start with the household staff. Someone must have seen something." That night, Noah called Rosa, our former housekeeper. She agreed to meet us the next evening at a small park near her apartment. When we found her, she looked thinner than I remembered, her hair streaked gray, but her eyes warmed when she saw us. "My dears," she said, hugging us both. I wanted to reach out, but she made it impossible. We sat at a bench near the fountain, the sound of children playing in the background. I asked if she'd noticed anything unusual before my father passed. Rosa hesitated, glancing around, then spoke in a whisper. "I heard her once Lila on the phone with a lawyer I didn't recognize. She said, 'Make sure the paperwork is handled.' Later that night, I saw your father in his study signing documents. He looked so tired, barely holding the pen. When I asked if he wanted water, she told me to leave. Her eyes filled. He didn't understand what he was signing, Grace. I'm sure of it." Noah clenched his jaw, staring at the ground. I thanked her quietly, promising her that her words would matter. When we left, the evening air had turned cool and the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. She used him when he was sick. Noah said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer, because there was nothing left to add. The truth was sitting between us, like a stone, heavy cold, and undeniable. Back in the car, I looked out the window at the city, passing by the skyline, catching the last light of day. Somewhere in those towers were the answers we needed. Lila had taken the house, the money, and the name, but she hadn't taken the truth. As Noah drove, I watched the horizon shift from gold to gray, thinking of my father's words about integrity, about leaving things better than you found them. I whispered a promise I didn't plan to break. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. And as the first drops of rain hit the windshield, I knew where we'd go next, back to the records, back to the people who had been silenced, back to the beginning of the lie. The rain kept coming that night, soft against the windshield, as Noah drove through quiet streets. We didn't talk much. Every few blocks, a streetlight flickered across his face, pale and drawn. The truth Rosa shared had settled between us, heavy and cold. When we reached the motel, he left the car running and just stared ahead. "She made him sign those papers," he said finally. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to debate. We both knew. Inside the room was dark, except for the thin glow from the parking lot outside. I sat on the edge of the bed while Noah pulled the blinds shut. The silence pressed in thick with thoughts neither of us could name. I opened my father's old notebook, the one he used for company notes, and traced the indent of his handwriting still visible on the last page. He always said that trust was built in ink and kept in silence. Now I wondered how much of that silence had cost him. Morning brought a fog that hung low over the parking lot. Peter Lang called as I was packing our things. "I've been reviewing what you gathered," he said. "We're on the right path, but we need something stronger. Medical confirmation of your father's condition when those documents were signed." His voice was calm, deliberate, the way lawyers sound when they're walking a client across thin ice. "Do you know who was caring for him in those final weeks?" I told him about Karen Boyd, the private nurse Lila hired when Dad's health started failing. He paused. "If she's willing to speak, that could change everything." After we hung up, I found Karen's number in my phone, buried under old messages. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. I introduced myself, explained what we were trying to do. There was a long silence before she said, "Meet me tomorrow morning at the coffee shop near St. Paul's Hospital. It's safer to talk in person." The next day, the sun returned sharp and clear after days of rain. The coffee shop was quiet, except for the hum of the espresso machine. Karen was already there, sitting near the window, her hands wrapped around a paper cup. She looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from one bad night's sleep. When I sat down, she took a deep breath. "Your father was kind to me," she said softly. "He trusted people easily, even when he shouldn't have." I listened as she described those final weeks. How Lila would arrive with stacks of papers, insisting he review them immediately, how he seemed confused, sometimes barely awake. He didn't always know what day it was, Karen said, her voice low, but she kept bringing more documents, telling him they were routine forms. When I asked if he understood what he was signing, he just smiled and said, "Lila knows best." Her eyes filled. But he didn't know. I could see it. When she finished, I thanked her and promised her name wouldn't be mentioned unless she agreed. She nodded, relief flickering in her expression. "Do what he would have wanted," she said quietly before leaving. I watched her walk out into the sunlight and realized my hands were trembling around the cup. That night, Noah and I met Peter in his office. He listened to every detail, taking notes in his careful, looping handwriting. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Between Rosa's testimony and the nurse's account, we have grounds to file a contest, but we'll need to move fast before she moves assets overseas." He turned to his computer, typing a few commands, then glanced up at us. "There's one more thing you should know. I found the backup." My heart jumped. "The trust." He nodded slowly. "It's an encrypted file on the firm's old server, time-stamped and notarized months before your father's decline. It'll take time to verify, but if it holds, it's irrefutable." Noah leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Then we can prove it." Peter's eyes met mine. "Yes, but it will be a war, Grace. Be ready for that." The following week blurred into late nights and court filings. Peter prepared the petition to challenge the will, while Noah and I gathered every record we could find. Emails, photos, even old financial statements showing Dad's mental decline. Each document felt like a fragment of a life we were trying to rebuild from the ashes. Daniel Mercer sent a letter of support confirming Dad's business intentions, his tone formal but heartfelt. He meant for his legacy to rest with his children, he wrote. He said it often. One evening, I stopped by the old garden center, where our mother's roses had once come from. The owner, Mrs. Talbot, recognized me immediately. "Your father used to come in every spring," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Said the pink ones reminded him of your mother. She showed me the same variety still blooming. I bought 2 small plants and placed them on the motel windowsill that night. It wasn't much, but it felt like a piece of home we could keep safe." A week later, Peter called with news that made my chest tighten. "The court date is set, 2 weeks from tomorrow." He sounded steady, but I could hear the weight in his voice. "Whitaker and Cole will represent your stepmother. They're sharp and they'll play rough." After the call, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the roses against the window pane. Outside, the traffic lights changed colors, without reason, red to green to yellow, like the world was moving forward, whether we were ready or not. The night before the first hearing, Noah couldn't sleep. I found him sitting on the curb outside his jacket, pulled tight earbuds in, but no music playing. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" he asked. The question hung in the air, fragile and real. I sat beside him watching the headlights slide across the wet asphalt. "He'd want us to stand for what's right," I said finally. "That's enough." The morning of the hearing arrived gray and still. As we walked up the courthouse steps, the sound of camera shutters echoed through the air. Reporters stood behind barricades calling Lila's name as she stepped from her car, polished and smiling. She waved briefly, the picture of composure. Brooke trailed behind her, expression blank eyes, hidden behind sunglasses. I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in a window, tired, steady, older than I had felt a month ago. Inside the courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper. We sat behind Peter as he organized his folders, his movements precise. Across the aisle, Lila's attorney whispered to her, and she nodded, her expression unreadable. When the judge entered the room, rose in unison, and for a moment everything was silent except the sound of our breathing. The trial had begun. The first minutes passed in a blur of legal language. Whitaker, her lawyer, spoke first, outlining a story about devotion, about a loyal wife inheriting what her husband trusted her to manage. It was smooth, rehearsed, and wrong. I looked at Noah, his jaw tight, his hand clenched around the edge of the table. Peter leaned forward, calm and deliberate, waiting for his turn. When the judge gave him the floor, Peter stood, his voice even. "Your Honor, this case isn't about inheritance. It's about intent. It's about a man who built his life on integrity being manipulated at his weakest moment." His words didn't rise, didn't shout. They landed quietly, and that was somehow stronger. I felt the air shift, as if the room itself was listening. The judge nodded for him to continue. Peter opened a folder and glanced back at us before speaking. "We'll show you testimony from those who witnessed coercion, and we'll present records that contradict the will before you. But most importantly, we'll show you the document that reveals what Andrew Whitman truly intended a family trust meant for his children." My heart thudded in my chest, and I caught Lila's gaze across the room. Her smile faltered just slightly, the smallest crack, but it was there. The war Peter warned us about had begun, and we were standing in the center of it. When court adjourned for the day, the air outside felt heavier, thick with rain. Reporters shouted questions we didn't answer. Noah tugged my sleeve. "Do you think she's scared?" he asked quietly. I looked toward the dark car where Lila disappeared behind tinted glass. "Not yet," I said, "but she will be." That night back at the motel, I wrote down every detail, the questions, the faces, the tone of Lila's voice when she spoke to her lawyer. The roses on the windowsill had started to bloom under the lamp's warmth. Noah was asleep before I finished. I sat a while longer, the hum of the highway outside steady and low. Somewhere beyond the noise, I could almost hear my father's voice, calm and certain. "Keep your word, Grace." I closed the notebook. Tomorrow we'd need all the courage we could find. The second day of the hearing began with heavy clouds pressed low over the courthouse. The air felt close, the kind of humidity that promised rain but never delivered. Inside, the same tension hung over us, silent, heavy, waiting to break. Noah sat beside me, flipping through the notes we'd made, his hand trembling slightly against the paper. Peter was calm as always, but even he seemed more measured than usual, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. When the judge entered, the sound of his gavel cut through the whispering gallery like a single clean strike. Lila was already seated at her table, perfectly composed, in a pale gray suit that caught the light. Brooke sat behind her, eyes forward, her expression flat and unreadable. Their lawyer, Whitaker, adjusted his tie before standing. "Your Honor," he began, "my client cared for her husband until his final breath. The claim that she coerced him is not only false but cruel." He let the words hang before continuing. "She has the signed, notarized will witnessed and validated. This case, with all due sympathy to the children, should be dismissed." Peter rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "we're not questioning grief. We're questioning intent. The question before this court is whether Andrew Whitman understood what he signed and whether his signature reflected his true will or someone else's hand guiding his own." He motioned toward the stand. "We'll begin with witness testimony." Rosa was called first. She walked to the front with small, careful steps, her hands clasped tight. I watched her take the oath, her voice steady but soft. Peter asked her about the day she found my father signing papers under Lila's supervision. Rosa described it exactly as she had told us: the phone call, the closed study, the way Lila snapped when she interrupted. "He didn't look like himself," Rosa said quietly. "He looked lost and scared." Whitaker stood for cross-examination. His tone was polite but pointed. "Mrs. Alvarez, you were dismissed by my client, correct?" Rosa nodded. "So you hold resentment toward her?" Rosa's eyes flashed, not with anger, but with sadness. "I hold truth," she said. "That's all I have left." Whitaker frowned clearly, unsettled by her calm. Next, the nurse, Karen Boyd, took the stand. Her testimony was clear, her details clinical. He was weak, disoriented, and at times unable to follow a conversation, she said. "I witnessed his wife bring documents several times a week. She said they were financial updates, but his responses were inconsistent. Some days he didn't even remember signing them. When she stepped down, the courtroom grew quiet. Even the scratching of pens had stopped." Peter stood adjusting his glasses, then addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we have supporting medical records from that same period confirming cognitive decline, but the defense argues that intent outweighs condition. To settle that, I'll need to present one more piece of evidence." From his briefcase, he withdrew a small silver flash drive. The faint clink it made against the table drew every eye. "This," he said, "is a digital copy of the Whitman Family Trust created and notarized 18 months before Andrew Whitman's illness. It lists his children, Grace and Noah Whitman, as primary beneficiaries and trustees of the estate. This document predates the contested will and reflects his consistent business pattern establishing protection for his family." Whitaker shot to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, we have not verified authenticity. This could be fabricated." The judge leaned forward. "We'll verify it now." He motioned to the clerk, who inserted the drive into the courtroom computer. The screen flickered to life, displaying scanned pages filled with formal lettering and digital seals. My father's name appeared at the top of the document, followed by the words, "Whitman Family Trust Agreement." The date was clear, 18 months before his final illness. My heart thudded in my chest. The judge read in silence for a moment before speaking. "The signatures appear authentic. The timestamp matches the notary record. Mr. Lang, you confirm drafting this document?" Peter nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. Under Andrew Whitman's instruction." Across the aisle, Lila's composure cracked. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering sharply. Brooke shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at her lap. The room had changed. The certainty on their side was gone. Whitaker cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this could have been revoked later by the will. My client asserts that the trust was never activated." Peter responded calmly. "A trust like this is self-executing once funded. The mansion and the core estate assets were already placed within it before Mr. Whitman's decline. Any subsequent will, especially one signed under questionable capacity, cannot override it." The judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze settling on Lila. "Mrs. Whitman, did you have access to your husband's legal documents in the months leading up to his passing?" She hesitated. "I managed household affairs," she said slowly. That included mail and some paperwork. So yes, the judge pressed. Yes, she admitted. The word hung in the air like a confession. Peter's tone stayed gentle but firm. Did you ever discuss these changes with his attorney, Mr. Lang? No, she said, her voice tightening. He handled his own business. Peter's eyebrows lifted slightly. Yet you were present during the signing of several documents. He asked me to be there, she said quickly, to help. When court recessed for lunch, the air in the hallway buzzed with quiet conversation. Reporters leaned toward their microphones, summarizing what had just unfolded. Noah and I found a bench near the courthouse entrance. He didn't speak for a while, just stared through the glass doors where rain streaked down the sidewalk. Do you think this will be enough? He asked finally. I didn't know how to answer. Evidence could be clear, but people could still twist it. That afternoon, Lila took the stand. Her voice, calm at first, carried through the room. My husband loved his children, she said, glancing briefly toward us. But he also trusted me. He wanted me to preserve the family legacy. Her tone softened as she continued weaving a story about devotion and sacrifice, about sleepless nights at his bedside. He asked me to take charge, she said. He knew they weren't ready. Peter waited until she finished before standing. Mrs. Whitman, do you recall a conversation with a lawyer named Weston weeks before your husband's death? She blinked, thrown off balance. I don't, maybe once or twice. Peter lifted a printed phone record. This shows 8 calls over 3 weeks, each lasting longer than 30 minutes. Does that refresh your memory? Lila's mouth tightened. I don't remember what we discussed. Peter nodded slowly. Perhaps this will help. He read from his notes. Make sure the paperwork is handled before the end of the month. Does that sound familiar? The color drained from her face. Whitaker objected, but the judge overruled. Answer the question, Mrs. Whitman. Her fingers gripped the edge of the stand. I was protecting our assets, she said finally. Andrew didn't understand how complicated things had become. Or perhaps, Peter said quietly, he understood perfectly, and that's why he protected his children through the trust. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Lila shot to her feet. This is absurd, she cried. He promised me everything. The judge's gavel struck sharply. Mrs. Whitman, sit down. Brooke tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering something that made her flinch but obey. When court adjourned that day, I walked out into the late afternoon light, the rain finally gone. The air smelled like wet pavement and the first hint of spring. Noah caught up to me, his voice low. She's cracking. I nodded, my mind already turning toward the next step. The next session would bring the decision, but something deeper had already shifted. For the first time since the funeral, the truth had room to breathe. My father's voice echoed in memory, steady, patient, the way he spoke when he wanted a lesson to stick. Trust is only real if it stands through pressure. I looked back at the courthouse doors and exhaled. Whatever came next, we were ready for it. The courthouse felt different that morning, quieter, heavier somehow. The marble floors carried every sound from the shuffle of shoes to the nervous clearing of throats. When Noah and I arrived, Peter was already there, his files spread neatly across the table. He looked up and gave a brief nod, a small reassurance that steadied me more than words could. This was the day the case would turn, the day the truth would either hold or crumble. Across the aisle, Lila sat rigid in her chair, her expression calm again after yesterday's outburst. Her lawyer whispered something that made her lips tighten. Brooke wasn't with her this time. The judge entered and the room stood. The sound of his gavel echoed through the chamber like a clock striking noon. Whitaker spoke first, his voice smooth and deliberate. Your Honor, my client wishes to clarify her previous statements. She was under stress and did not intend to suggest wrongdoing. She maintains that Mr. Whitman's final will reflected his true wishes. He turned slightly, gesturing toward her. Mrs. Whitman only seeks to honor her late husband's trust in her. Peter rose calmly. Your Honor, if I may, yesterday's testimony and evidence show a consistent pattern of manipulation and concealment. But today, we will provide direct confirmation from the source himself, Mr. Andrew Whitman. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Even the judge lifted his head. Explain, he said. Peter reached into his briefcase and placed a sealed envelope on the table. Months before his passing, Mr. Whitman recorded a notarized statement stored with his business archives. It was discovered this morning with the assistance of his former partner, Mr. Daniel Mercer. He nodded toward the gallery where Daniel stood. His cane clicked softly against the floor as he approached the stand. Daniel took the oath, then looked toward me and Noah before beginning. Andrew knew how easily wealth divides families, he said. He worried about that. After he remarried, he told me more than once that he'd secured the estate in a family trust for his children. He wanted peace after he was gone, not war. He paused, his gaze steady on Lila. He asked me to hold a statement in case that peace was ever broken. Peter handed the envelope to the clerk, who unfolded the single-page letter inside. The paper trembled slightly in her hands as she read aloud. My father's voice came alive through the words, direct, practical, and certain. If there is ever confusion over my estate, the letter began. Let it be known that I have established a trust for my children, Grace and Noah. My wife Lila is cared for through separate provisions. The mansion and family holdings are to remain under my children's stewardship. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Lila's eyes darted to her attorney. Whitaker tried to recover. Your Honor, we can't verify when this document was created, but Peter was ready. He pointed to the notarization seal at the bottom. Dated 19 months before the contested will signed by an independent notary in Richmond and verified by business records filed that same week. The judge examined the page, his brow furrowing. Lila leaned forward suddenly, her voice sharp. He promised me more than this. He told me I'd never have to worry again. The judge's gaze snapped toward her. Mrs. Whitman, he said firmly, please sit down. She froze, breathing hard, then sank slowly back into her chair. Peter continued, his voice even, but waited. Your Honor, this confirms what we've maintained all along, that the contested will was signed under duress and does not represent Andrew Whitman's intention. The trust and the statement before you make that clear. When the judge called for a short recess, I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath. The air was cool and dry, the faint scent of floor polish mixing with coffee from a nearby cart. Noah stood beside me, hands buried in his pockets. I can't believe he thought this far ahead, he said softly. Dad knew, I answered. He always did. Inside, the second half of the session unfolded quickly. Whitaker did what he could to salvage the case, questioning Daniel's memory, implying possible forgery, but every argument landed weaker than the last. The evidence was too solid. When the judge finally called the room to order for his ruling, the silence was thick enough to feel. He began slowly reviewing the findings, the witness statements, the trust verification, and the signed letter. Then he turned toward Lila. Mrs. Whitman, he said, the court finds that the will presented cannot supersede the established Whitman family trust. It is invalid under law. The estate, including the primary residence and assets, shall revert to Grace and Noah Whitman as beneficiaries. His gavel struck once final and firm. The sound washed over me like a rush of air. Noah's hand found mine under the table, his grip tight, unsteady. Across the room, Lila sat motionless, the color drained from her face. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but she didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused. When the session ended, the crowd in the gallery broke into quiet conversation. Some people smiled in our direction, others avoided our eyes. Peter packed his files, moving with quiet efficiency. It's done, he said softly. You can finally go home. Outside, the sunlight felt strange after days of gray skies. The courthouse steps gleamed, still slick from the morning rain. Reporters clustered nearby microphones, extended voices blending into a low buzz. We walked past them without stopping. Noah's shoulders were shaking, not from tears, but from a kind of release neither of us had words for. The car ride back to the estate was silent. When the gates came into view, I felt something loosen in my chest. The iron bars, once closed against us, now swung open slowly. The guards from before were gone. Only the sound of gravel under the tires filled the air. The mansion stood just as it always had, tall, bright, unyielding, but it felt different now. Lighter, maybe. We parked at the foot of the steps. Noah hesitated before stepping out. Do we just go in? He asked quietly. I nodded. We do. The front doors opened easily under my hand. The hallway smelled faintly of furniture polish and dust. Sheets covered the furniture, and half-packed boxes lined the foyer. The echoes of our footsteps followed us up the stairs. In the study, sunlight spilled across the desk where my father once sat. Papers lay scattered, some from the court filings, others forgotten entirely. I reached for the top drawer and found what I'd come looking for. His leather journal, the one he always kept close. The cover was worn soft with time. I opened it carefully, the pages filled with his handwriting notes about the company memories of my mother and small reminders to himself. On the last page, written in his steady hand, were 5 words that stopped me cold. Protect them. Always. Trust love. I traced the ink with my finger, my throat tight. Noah stood at the window looking out toward the garden. It still doesn't feel real, he said. It will, I answered. We just need time. Downstairs, the faint creak of a door made us both turn. It was Peter. He stood in the doorway, smiling faintly. I thought I'd deliver the final papers in person, he said. Your father would be proud. He placed a folder on the desk. Take a few weeks before making any decisions about the property. You've both earned a little peace. After he left, Noah sat at the piano in the music room. The keys were slightly out of tune, but his fingers found a melody anyway, soft, hesitant at first, then full-filling the empty house with sound. It was the same piece he used to play for our parents after dinner. I listened from the doorway until the last note faded. The sun dipped lower outside, spilling gold light across the marble floors. The house didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt like it had been waiting. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the banister, the photographs still hanging in the hallway. Every corner held echoes of the life we'd lost, and somehow the beginning of something new. As evening settled, I found Noah standing on the terrace, the wind stirring his hair. What happens now? He asked quietly. I looked toward the horizon, where the last of the light was fading. Now, I said, we decide what this home is going to mean. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. Then let's make it something worth remembering. The first stars appeared above the garden. Somewhere deep inside, I felt my father's presence, not as a shadow, but as warmth. The fight was over, but the story of what we built next had just begun. The days that followed the verdict passed quietly, though nothing about them felt ordinary. The mansion, once filled with tension and silence, now echoed with a different kind of stillness, a space waiting to be lived in again. Noah spent most mornings at the piano practicing until the music carried through the hallways and into the garden. It was the same melody he used to play for our parents, a soft thread of sound that made the place feel alive again. I spent those first few days walking through each room, dusting off memories as much as furniture. There were notes still pinned to the bulletin board in the kitchen, my father's handwriting reminders about board meetings, lists of garden supplies. Every mark felt like a breadcrumb leading back to the person he was, the man whose steadiness had built all of this. The media coverage didn't fade as quickly as I hoped. Every paper and news site ran the same headline, "Step-family dispute ends in courtroom reversal." The words felt colder in print than they had in reality. Lila's name appeared in smaller letters beneath ours, but her absence from public view spoke louder than any statement could. She had left the state within days of the ruling, selling her remaining shares in one of my father's smaller ventures, and disappearing into the kind of quiet money can buy. Brooke transferred to a private school out west. The guards were gone, and for the first time in months, the gate stood open. One evening, as the light faded across the garden, I found Noah sitting on the back steps, the faint scent of rain still in the air. He was staring at the fountain, its water still murky from months of neglect. "It doesn't look right," he said, breaking the quiet. "It used to shine." I followed his gaze. "We can fix it," I said. He nodded, though I could tell he wasn't talking about the fountain. The next morning I called Peter to discuss the estate's next steps. He arrived that afternoon, briefcase in hand as always, but his demeanor softer now. We sat in the study surrounded by boxes of documents, and he explained what came next, transferring assets, updating the trust, setting up maintenance accounts. "You don't have to do everything at once," he said gently. "Let the house breathe. Let yourselves breathe." When he left, I wandered upstairs into my father's office. The smell of cedar still lingered in the drawers. On the desk lay the leather journal I'd found after the trial, the one with his notes and memories. I opened it again, this time reading slower. He'd written about business decisions, about Mom's passing, and about us small observations that made my throat tighten. One entry stood out. "When the day comes that I'm no longer here, may this house remind them not of my wealth, but of our love." That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain had started again, tapping gently on the windows. I walked downstairs barefoot, the old wood cool beneath my feet. In the great room, moonlight caught the edges of the picture frames still hanging along the staircase. Family trips, birthdays, a photograph of Mom at the piano with Noah beside her, no taller than the keys. I realized then that keeping this place closed off would only turn it into a museum of grief. It wasn't meant for that. The next morning, I brewed coffee and stood at the window overlooking the gardens. The roses we'd replanted after Lila's crew tore them out were starting to bloom. Their color was softer than before, but they were alive. I turned to Noah. "What if we made this place something more?" He looked at me confused. "What do you mean, opening it?" I said. "Dad built this to be lived in, to bring people together. What if it could do that again for others who need it?" He thought for a moment, then set his mug down. "You mean like a foundation?" I nodded. "For artists, musicians, kids who lost everything like we did. A place to heal, to start over." The idea took root faster than I expected. Within a week, we met with Daniel Mercer to discuss logistics. He listened quietly, then smiled in that slow, measured way he always did. "Your father would have loved this," he said. "He believed in purpose, not just profit. He offered to help draft the mission plan and even connect us with the local arts council." Peter joined the effort too, handling the legal side. He helped us convert part of the estate into a nonprofit, the Whitman Foundation House. We spent long nights reviewing blueprints, deciding which rooms to open, which to keep private. The ballroom would become a music hall. The East Wing would hold art studios and reading rooms. The library would stay just as it was, every book a memory we wanted to share. Renovations began within the month. The halls filled again, not with arguments or whispers, but with the sound of hammers' laughter and the soft rhythm of progress. Volunteers came from nearby towns, students, retirees, even a few of my father's former employees. Rosa returned too, her smile bright as she unpacked old china from the storage closet. "Feels like home again," she said, brushing dust off a teacup. One afternoon, Noah found me in the garden where the fountain had been restored to working order. The water sparkled under the sun, and the reflection of the house shimmered across the surface. "It's strange," he said quietly. "I used to think this place was just a reminder of what we lost. Now it feels like something we built ourselves." I smiled. That's exactly what it should be. By late summer, the mansion had transformed. The once empty rooms now held easels and pianos, laughter echoing through open windows. Children practiced scales in the music room, while volunteers planted new flowers in the garden. We kept one small section, private Dad's study, untouched, a quiet space of remembrance. Everything else pulsed with life. The day of the opening ceremony came bright and clear. A banner hung across the front gates reading, "Whitman Foundation, House Opening Doors Through Art." People from across the city arrived, neighbors, local press friends of my father who hadn't seen the estate in years. Daniel stood beside us during the ribbon, cutting his hand steady on Noah's shoulder. "You did good, both of you," he said softly. "You brought the heart back." When the guests began to explore the rooms, I walked upstairs to the balcony that overlooked the courtyard. From there, I could see everything, the gardens in bloom, children playing music, drifting from the open hall. Noah sat at the piano again, guiding a young boy's hands across the keys. The melody rose gentle and sure, filling the space between memory and future. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted by what had been taken. It felt full again, of sound, of laughter, of purpose. I leaned against the railing, closing my eyes as the music swelled. Somewhere in the quiet, I could almost hear my father's voice, warm and calm. "You did it, Grace. You kept the promise." As the sun dipped low, casting gold across the walls, I looked toward the garden, where the fountain's reflection shimmered like glass. "We're home," I whispered the words, carried away by the breeze. But deep down, I knew there was still one thing left to do. something that would finally close the circle my father had started. And tomorrow, I planned to begin. The morning after the foundation's opening felt different, quiet but full, the kind of calm that follows a storm. I stood by the balcony overlooking the courtyard where volunteers were cleaning up from the night before. The last of the lanterns still hung over the garden, their glass catching the sunlight. For the first time in years, the mansion felt whole. Downstairs, Noah was sorting through stacks of donation envelopes that had come in overnight. He looked up when I entered, his hair a mess from sleep, and smiled faintly. We raised more than we thought, he said. Enough to fund the first scholarship class. I took the envelope he handed me and read the top letter, a note from a local teacher thanking us for reopening the library. It was small, but it meant something. "Dad would have liked this," Noah said quietly. I nodded. He'd be proud. Later that afternoon, I met Peter and Daniel in the study. They had come to finalize the transfer of company shares into the foundation's trust. Daniel leaned back in his chair, looking around the room with a half-smile. "Your father always said this place would outlive him," he said. He was right. Peter passed me the final documents to sign, the sound of paper soft in the quiet room. "After this," he said, "everything your father left behind will be exactly where he meant it to be." When they left, the house felt still again. I wandered through the hallway, passing portraits that had once felt too heavy to look at. They didn't hurt now. They just belonged. The scent of the new roses drifted through the open windows, and from somewhere near the back of the house, I could hear the faint rhythm of Noah's piano. It blended with the hum of the fountain outside, steady and low, like the heartbeat of something living. That evening, I drove to the edge of the property where the older part of the garden met the woods. The sun had dropped low, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. It was where my father used to walk after long days, just him and the quiet. I hadn't been back there since before the funeral. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I followed the path. Halfway down, I stopped. Someone was standing by the fence. It took a moment to recognize her. Lila. Her hair was shorter now, her clothes simple, her face lined with exhaustion I hadn't seen before. She turned when she heard me, eyes wary, but calm. "I didn't come to make trouble," she said. "I just wanted to see it one last time." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt like it might shatter under the weight of everything that had happened. Finally, I said, "You could have asked." She gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Would you have said yes?" I didn't answer. She looked past me toward the mansion, its windows glowing faintly with the light from inside. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I thought taking it would make me feel secure. I thought if I controlled it, I'd finally matter." Her voice trembled not from tears, but from something deeper, resignation. "But all it did was ruin me. The money's gone. Brooke barely speaks to me. Everything I built was made from someone else's foundation, and it fell the moment I touched it." I stood there listening, unsure what to feel. She turned back to me, her eyes clearer than I remembered. "You were right," she said. "This house never belonged to me. I just didn't know how to let go." For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of the trees. "You can come inside," I said finally. "Not to stay, but to see it. One last time." We walked in silence back toward the mansion. Inside, the grand hall was lit by the low glow of the chandelier. Lila paused at the bottom of the staircase, her gaze tracing the walls, the restored paintings, the polished floors. "It feels different," she whispered. "Lighter. It's alive again," I said quietly. "It has purpose now." She nodded, eyes glistening. He would have liked that. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "I found this when I was packing," she said. "I think it belongs here." She handed it to me and stepped back. Inside was my mother's gold locket, the one she wore every day until the night she died. I hadn't seen it since before Lila moved in. My throat tightened. "Why now?" I asked. She looked down, her voice faint. "Because I've been holding on to things that were never mine. I thought if I kept enough pieces I could rewrite the past, but I can't." She turned toward the door, her heels soft against the marble. "I'm leaving the state for good. I won't bother you again." I watched her walk out into the night, her figure fading beyond the gates. For the first time, I didn't feel anger, just closure. The next morning, I placed my mother's locket on the mantel above the fireplace in Dad's study. The sun streamed through the windows, catching on the gold. Noah came in behind me holding a mug of coffee. "What's that?" he asked. "A piece of her," I said. "Back where it belongs." We spent the rest of the day in the garden trimming the roses and repairing the fountain's stone edge. Volunteers came and went, laughter drifting through the air. By late afternoon, the mansion looked just as it had the day before the storm of our lives began, strong-grounded, peaceful. As the sky deepened into dusk, I walked out to the balcony again. Down below the courtyard, lights flickered on one by one, and I could see the shadows of people leaving through the gates, their voices soft and content. Noah stood at the piano by the open window, the same melody from our childhood spilling into the night. For a moment, I let everything fade, the noise, the weight, even the ache that had followed me since the funeral. All that remained was light. The house, the garden, the music, it all felt like breathing again. When Noah finished playing, he turned toward me. "You think we'll ever see her again?" he asked. I shook my head. "Maybe, but if we do, I hope she's finally at peace." He nodded, then smiled faintly. "So are we." The stars were coming out one by one, scattered over the dark sky. I stayed there until the air grew cool, thinking of how far we'd come from standing outside locked gates to opening them for others. The Whitman Foundation house wasn't just ours anymore. It belonged to every person who would walk through those doors and find hope waiting on the other side. And as I turned to go back inside, I glanced at the locket glowing softly in the firelight. For the first time in years, I felt no ghosts in the room, only grace and the quiet promise that love had kept its word. Tomorrow would bring new people, new beginnings, new laughter, echoing down those long hallways. But tonight, the mansion rested whole again. The morning after Lila's visit, the air felt lighter. A soft mist clung to the gardens, and the house carried that quiet hum that only comes after something has finally settled. I made coffee and stood by the window watching the first rays of sunlight slide over the fountain. It was strange how peace doesn't arrive with fanfare, but with silence. Noah joined me a few minutes later, still half asleep, his hair messy and his sweatshirt inside out. "You were up early," he said, yawning as he reached for a mug. I nodded. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything that's happened. He poured coffee and leaned against the counter, looking out toward the garden. "Feels like we've been living two different lives, the one before all this and the one after." I smiled faintly. "The one after is better." He didn't answer, but I could see in his expression that he agreed. The bruises left by betrayal had finally faded, replaced by something gentler, acceptance. Later that day, Daniel and Peter came by for a quick meeting about the Foundation's progress. They were both smiling before they even stepped through the door. "The city's partnering with you," Daniel said, handing me a folder. "They want to expand the program, more scholarships, more community events." I flipped through the paperwork, overwhelmed by the momentum. "It's really happening," I said quietly. Peter gave a small, approving nod. "Your father would have been proud, Grace. You took something broken and turned it into something good." After they left, I walked through the halls again, just as I had the day we returned after the verdict. But this time the echoes were different voices of children from the art rooms, the faint hum of conversation from the library, the sound of piano keys floating from the music hall, where Noah was teaching a new group of students. Life had filled every corner that grief once emptied. In the study, I paused by the fireplace where my mother's locket still rested. The light from the window glinted off its gold surface. I touched it gently and thought of my parents, their patience, their strength, the lessons they left behind. I realized then that justice hadn't just been about winning the house or the trust. It had been about reclaiming what they taught us, that legacy isn't measured by wealth, but by the love and integrity we leave behind. That evening, the Foundation hosted its first small concert in the ballroom. Chairs lined the marble floor, and strings of white lights hung from the ceiling like stars. Noah performed with his students, his hands steady on the keys, each note carrying warmth through the room. I sat in the back, surrounded by families listening, as laughter replaced the echoes of the past. It felt like the mansion itself was breathing again. When the last song ended, Noah looked out over the audience and smiled. "This place used to be silent," he said. "Now it sings." His words drew a soft murmur of applause. For a moment I closed my eyes and let the music linger in the air. It sounded like healing. After the guests left, I stayed behind to turn off the lights. The garden glowed faintly through the windows, and the night smelled of rain and roses. As I walked out onto the terrace, I thought of Lila's final words, how she'd said she only wanted to see it one last time. I hoped she found her peace. We had found ours. Noah joined me outside, carrying a blanket and 2 mugs of tea. We sat on the stone steps, the sound of crickets filling the spaces between our words. "You ever think about what Dad meant when he said to protect it?" he asked. I nodded. He didn't mean the house. He meant everything it stood for: family, kindness, second chances. He smiled, his gaze fixed on the glowing windows. "Then I guess we're doing all right." I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the weight of the journey that had brought us here. The fights, the courtroom, the sleepless nights, it all led to this quiet moment of peace. Somewhere inside, I could almost hear my father's voice again, steady and calm. "You did what was right." The wind picked up rustling through the trees, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the volunteers cleaning up inside. It reminded me that the house wasn't ours alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who would walk through those doors, searching for hope. As the night deepened, I stood and looked back at the mansion, its tall windows glowing against the dark sky, the fountain's reflection shimmering beneath the moonlight. "We kept the promise, Dad," I whispered. "We protected it." Walking back inside, I felt the warmth of home wrap around me, not the kind built by money or marble, but the kind made of forgiveness, love, and purpose. That was the legacy my parents left behind, and that's what would carry us forward. Before turning in for the night, I paused at the door to the study and took one last look at the locket on the mantel. It caught the firelight and shimmered softly, like a heartbeat that never stopped. I smiled, knowing that the story wasn't about what we'd lost, it was about what we'd rebuilt. If you've ever fought for something that felt impossible or carried the weight of a family you couldn't fix, I hope you find your peace too, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with revenge, it arrives quietly in forgiveness and the life you build afterward. And if this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love endures even after everything else fades.